What do you think about when you hear the word Berlin? If you lived during the 1940s or a World War II historian, you probably think of bombed out buildings and widespread devastation. From the 1950s through the 1980s, it was a flashpoint in the Cold War, the dividing line between East and West. More recently, it has been a modern and cosmopolitan European capital city. During the 1920s and 30s, however, Berlin, Germany was a much different place. The Weimar Republic, or as it was known at the time, the German Republic, sprung to life following Germany's defeat in World War I, and its capital city of Berlin was also the new capital of Europe's chaotic social scene. Now, Berlin had become the thriving center of arts, education, science, and philosophy for all Europe. But this begs the question, why would the capital of a war-torn country like Germany draw so many creative influences? Why wouldn't they be attracted to places like Paris or Madrid or Rome? It seems counterintuitive. The answer is twofold. First, the need to rebuild Germany led to an influx of laborers, particularly in the essential fields of trade, communication, and construction. And this led to a boom in commerce, and the money began to flow. Additionally, in many cases, these new migrants brought with them elements of their own cultures, introducing that diversity into German society. Now, the second factor was liberalism introduced by the establishment of a Republican form of government. One example of this was the acceptance of Jewish intellectuals such as Albert Einstein and Max Planck into universities, something that had been highly restricted during the pre-war period. This resulted in flourishing of the scientific community and a wealth of new developments in science and technology, and tremendous strides in the social sciences like philosophy, psychology, and sociology followed suit. Philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Leo Strauss, and Hannah Arendt achieved worldwide acclaim for their progressive ideas. Now, this new emphasis on education reform extended to the primary school level as well, where experimental methods of learning were introduced and greater emphasis was placed on physical education as a way to improve overall health. It was perhaps the arts where the clearest examples of this new liberalism were demonstrated. In the performing arts, stage, screen, etc., romanticism and idealism were discarded in favor of realism and the brutality of everyday life. Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera, a very popular musical that opened in 1928, purports to illustrate the ills of capitalism from a socialist viewpoint. Now, corruption, social chaos, and oppression were popular themes in cinema, with 1922's Dr. Maybu's The Gambler and 1927's Metropolis being prime examples. This liberalism, which also held a decidedly leftist perspective, was also reflected in the visual arts and design. Many painters and sculptors focused on illustrating the horrors of war, moral decadence, and the plight of the poor. Designers gravitated towards an industrial aesthetic and minimalism, eschewing elegance in favor of utility. Of course, the music, jazz, ruled the roost. For example, the film version of the aforementioned Threepenny Opera and the movie The Blue Angel were both highly successful films featuring jazz soundtracks. And there were a number of cafes and jazz clubs across the country featuring acts such as Bernard Ette, Deus Bella, Marek Weber, Efim Schackmeister, and Stefan Weintraub. Of course, these things alone weren't in and of themselves responsible for the decadent reputation of Berlin gained in those heady days. They were merely incidental to it. But as with a lot of things, they incurred guilt by association. What really put Berlin over the top was the leniency of federal censorship and general permissiveness of the Republican government. This is not intended to be an indictment of those policies because, as a result, Berlin was a very lively and creative place to be in the 1920s before the Nazis came to power. A present-day Las Vegas on steroids, if you will. Although what happened in Berlin didn't necessarily stay in Berlin. Prostitution, drugs, and crime, ills that often arise in areas where there's great economic expansion, but not enough skilled workers to meet demand. Lots of cash was being generated, but the gulf between rich and poor was also growing quickly. Women with no other means of support took to the streets, engaging in prostitution. However, it was not only women. Men also took advantage of the new permissiveness and rarely found themselves short of clients. As it turned out, many men had their first encounters with homosexuality in the army, and upon returning home, saw no reason not to indulge themselves if they were so inclined. Now, this sexual revolution found its way into other outlets as well. Cabaret clubs sprang up, offering all manner of adult-oriented entertainment, including striptease and burlesque performances, drag queens. There was even a museum of sexology in Berlin run by a certain Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. In cinema, too, there was no longer hesitancy to take on controversial themes. As early as 1919, Richard Oswald directed a picture entitled Prostitution, which, as can be expected, dealt with that very subject, equating it with white slavery. Oswald also released Different from Others, which dealt honestly with homosexuality. William Dieterle's Sex in Chains and George Papp's Pandora's Box also took on the subject of homosexuality, neither facing any serious criticism. Naturally, Berlin became a magnet for those who practiced what would be best termed as alternative lifestyles. While gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships were not as open as they are today, there was very much sort of a wink-wink, nod-nod attitude towards these sorts of relationships. Men became members of, quote, friendship clubs, and everyone was aware of what went on there. The sexual liberation of Berlin was so profound that it frequently was mentioned in tourist literature. Of course, it was not only the men who were attracted to Berlin's gay scene. In addition to nightclubs like the Dorian Gray and the El Dorado, which catered almost exclusively to gay men, there were also establishments such as Chez Mabel Sur that served the lesbian clientele. As Clayton J. Wisnat, professor of history at Wofford College in South Carolina, noted in a 2016 article in The Advocate, Ruth Margaret Rolig, who wrote a famous city guide to the Berlin lesbian scene in 1928, remarked, "Here each one can find their own happiness, for they make a point of satisfying every taste." And the scene was not restricted only to gay men and women and bisexuals. There was also a burgeoning transvestite and or transgender culture growing within the city. Wisnat further wrote in his article that Paul Knack, a criminologist and psychiatrist, noted that in one of the establishments, he had the pleasure of hearing the local bartender sing a song about the third sex that one of the members had composed. As the bartender sang, he threw off his apron, pulled on a braided wig and woman's hat, and made all kinds of feminine movements and facial expressions that a professional female impersonator could hardly improve on. Unfortunately, all this gaiety and excitement ended with the Nazi takeover of power in 1933. Interestingly enough, despite the public stance of the Nazis against what they considered decadent and immoral, certain clubs that tickled the fancy of the certain Nazi officials were allowed to remain open. Hypocrisy was one of the hallmarks of Nazi rule. It was, however, the end of an era in Berlin. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I encourage you to read more on Berlin and the German Republic in the 1920s and early 30s. It was a really fascinating place with great and sometimes disturbing art. It would take several episodes to cover it in depth, but I do want to keep the focus primarily on jazz, at least for now. Perhaps at some point in the future I can do additional episodes on this topic if you're interested, because it's always fun to be a little decadent. As always, I'd appreciate it if you'll subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button. And if you can think of anything in particular that you'd like me to cover, by all means, leave a comment and I'll put it on my list of future episodes. Next week should be kind of fun for the real hardcore jazz fans. It'll deal with some of the folks that have been encountered in the jazz scene in Europe in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And, hopefully some of these names you'll recognize, and there'll probably be a few in there that you don't recognize. So we definitely want to see you here next week. So have fun, and we'll see you next week.